If you're looking for proven ways to take your fundraising results to the next level, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast, hosted by Tammy Zonker. Tammy has trained and led thousands of nonprofit organizations to collectively raise more than $500 million and is also recognized as one of America's top 20 fundraising experts. This is the podcast where Tammy equips and empowers amazing fundraising pros like you to transform your fundraising so you can transform the world. And now, let's hear from Tammy.
Today, I'm talking with my friend Stephen Shattuck, Director of Engagement at Capital Campaign Pro, where I'm proud to serve as a senior advisor. He's a recognized thought leader in the nonprofit sector with more than 15 years of experience advising nonprofits on donor communication, data management, and digital content. Stephen has contributed content to the National Council of Nonprofits, AFP, Advancing Philanthropy Magazine, N10, and the Nonprofit Hub. He's also a frequent webinar presenter and conference speaker, having spoken at AFP Icon, the International Conference, NATO, Cause Camp, ADRP, the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference, and Planet Philanthropy, just to name a few. He's also the author of Robots Make Bad Fundraisers, How Nonprofits Can Maintain Heart in the Digital Age. So this was published in 2020 by Bold and Bright Media. And Stephen came on the podcast to talk about that book. You'll find it as episode 7. And by the end of this year, we will have crossed the 100th episode threshold. So you can see just how long Stephen's been contributing to our sector. He also contributed to Fundraising Principles and Practices, 2nd edition. He's brilliant, he's funny, and he's here to talk about the 2024 State of Capital Campaigns Benchmark Report. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so delighted. And you're one of the few people that we've had back more than once.
Yeah, that's fun. I didn't realize I was number 7. That's a lucky number.
It is a lucky number, and we're lucky to have you then and now. Let's just jump in. This is the 2nd annual State of Capital Campaigns Benchmark Report. Tell us how you approached the study and who was surveyed.
Yeah, so this is our 2nd annual study, like you said. So we did the first one last year. It was a bit of a pet project for me at Capital Campaign Pro. Last year, we sort of identified a gap in real research around capital campaigns. It's sort of a fundraising discipline that relies on anecdotes and case studies, which is all fine, but we sort of thought it's missing that third piece, right, of actual hard empirical data. And we have such a big audience at Capital Campaign Pro. We thought, well, why not ask that audience, how they approach capital campaigns for people who are just thinking about it and people that are in campaigns or recently finished them. How did it go? What were the struggles? What were the successes? How did you approach it? So we put together a survey, and last summer, just a few months ago, we sent out our 2nd annual survey. And this year we updated a lot of the questions, but one of the main things we were trying to do is test the results of the first study, right? There's always a little bit of nervousness around the first go ahead. Like, did you really get a full swath of the entire sector, or did you just get a bunch of, kind of corner case people sharing their data? So for this year, there was a little bit of nervousness, but as we got results in, despite doubling the data set, a lot of the numbers, really most of the numbers from last year held pretty strong, within single digit percentage points. So that was sort of an interesting relief for us to be able to say, okay, not only does the data from the first year seem to be good because of that, but now we have even more, over 500 nonprofits, all at varying stages of a capital campaign, sending in their thoughts and results. So we're going to keep doing this every year and, add and tweak questions as we go along. But it seems like now we've got a really strong foundation for really how most of the sector approaches campaigns, the things that they encounter. And our goal is for people to read this and be encouraged, especially the ones that are thinking about a campaign, to say, hey, this is usually how it goes for people. These are the things that they run into. That way they're not sort of caught off guard by what they encounter over the course of 1, 2, 3, 5 years of a campaign. So that's what we did. It's going to be coming out very soon. It's probably already out if you're listening to this. So download it, whether or not you're thinking about a campaign, in one, or even just recently finished one, because you're going to see a lot of insights there that'll help you along no matter what stage you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is encouraging. And frankly, I'm so grateful that you've stepped into this void because there has been no research, no study, as you said, that has really spoke to the state of capital campaigns in an actual empirical data perspective. So it's such a great resource. Let's kind of unpack what you found. Are capital campaigns typically successful these days? And how do external factors like the economy or politics or presidential election, do they negatively affect campaign?
That's a good question. And it's one of the other sort of main reasons why we wanted to do the study. When we conceived of it kind of late 22, early 23, I'm going to have to tell you or your listeners, that was kind of a tumultuous time, going back to the beginning of the pandemic. So one thing we were really curious about is, did sort of all the events of 20 through 23 impact campaign planning and certainly campaign execution? So to answer your first question, most of the people who responded who have recently completed a campaign considered their campaign a success. It was around 96% of people thought that, regardless of the amount of money that they raised, whether it was above or below that 100% goal threshold, they still considered it a success. So it seems like, and again, this held strong from last year also, so this was a consistent metric that I mentioned before. It seems like if you go through a campaign, if you kind of stick it out and really, finish and see it all the way through, it tends to be successful. And this is something we wanted to highlight because when we talk to people at Capital Campaign Pro, and I'm sure any campaign consultant can, empathize with this, people are nervous, right? It's a big deal. We're raising $10 million, even if we're raising $1 or $3 million, depending on the size of the org. This is a big deal. It's usually a multiple of the annual fund. For a lot of people, it's their first campaign, either at the org or as a professional. And we want to be able to tell people, hey, if you really see it through, you're probably going to be happy with the results, right? Now, that is not to say that there aren't challenges, that sometimes campaigns, get paused or go off the rails. But if you really endeavor to do this, it seems to be, and this is, hundreds of nonprofits saying this, that they're happy with the results. There were people who raised 75% of their goal, 80% of their goal, who said they were still happy with it. That's still a lot of money. And, not to mention a lot of learning experience over the course of that campaign. So that's kind of the first thing to say, be encouraged. If you're going to go down this road, for the most part, you're probably going to be, happy with the results. Now, that is not to say that some people weren't happy with results or that I'm Pollyannish about it, but most people are. And then with challenges, last year in the first study, we really took this head on and asked people specifically, did you pause because of the pandemic? And also, did you pause because of the economy, right? Back in early 23, lots of fears around recession. It seems like we're headed towards a soft landing now, but that was by no means a foregone conclusion a year or 2 years ago. So most people said, no, they did not pause because of the pandemic or because of any economic uncertainty. And then this year we went ahead and just asked kind of a more general question, do you feel that external factors negatively impacted your campaign? And a majority of people, around 56% of people said no. So it's still a factor out there. And we sort of dive deeper into, what were those specific challenges. But for the most part, when it comes to campaigns, people keep their foot on the gas despite what's going on in the world, right? There's always going to be something, the economy, hopefully we won't have another pandemic, but in a lot of ways, the pandemic is still going on, right? We have a contentious election cycle coming up. If you hadn't noticed that, probably have natural disasters, localized issues. There will always be something. But, this is something I've been saying for decades to fundraisers, whoever will listen, is if you've got a clear need and a strong case for support and a vision, go. Don't decide for your donors. You may get a no. You may get people say, you know what, things are just too hectic now. I can't donate. But if you make the decision for people, that's really a shame, especially when we're talking about projects associated with capital campaigns that are transformative, right? New buildings, new facilities, new programs, go. Now, again, you're going to face headwinds, but most people don't let that stop them. And certainly they're not things that totally derail the campaign. But there were challenges. Inflation, of course, was a big thing this year. People's construction costs increased, which increased their goal and therefore increased the amount of money they had to raise. But they overcame it, or at least faced it head on. And if it meant, raising a little bit more than they expected, and maybe there's the square footage of the building is a couple thousand less than they thought, they still did it and still considered it a success.
I think of it kind of like, when is the best time to have a baby? Right?
Exactly.
I mean, it boils down to, what do you want?
Yep.
And just making it happen. And
Yep.
I mean, in my experience with campaigns and just major gift fundraising in general, when you have that passion, that compelling vision, and you can tell the story and the intended measurable outcomes in concert with one another, people catch that vision. Your top supporters, your most loyal supporters, they want to see that happen for you. It's data, it's best practice, it's a process, and there's a little sprinkle of magic.
Absolutely.
So, Stephen, what is the money typically being raised for? We have, capital, good old fashioned bricks and mortar, but more and more organizations are conducting campaigns to increase their capacity or to grow their endowment to help fund the annual programs, keeping the lights on, the salaries, all the day-to-day operations, or some combination. So in the study, what did you find in terms of what people are raising money for, or what the mix of purposes is presently? We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Kindsight builds technology that helps nonprofits make a difference. It was born when 3 leading-edge nonprofit technologies, iWave, Ascend, and Nonprofit OS, came together to better support organizations with purpose-built tools designed to make fundraising easier, faster, and more effective. With a combined 40 years working with nonprofits and other fundraising organizations, we have seen the generosity landscape evolve and change in ways we never could have predicted. It's become clear that the best approach to fundraising is a personalized and meaningful one, a human approach. But that's not easy when goals are high and resources are scarce. That's where Kindsight comes in. With Kindsight, fundraisers can find and qualify potential donors with the world's largest proprietary donor database, engage with those donors quickly and effectively with AI-powered content generation, and keep everything on track with a centralized CRM built specifically for fundraising teams. Connect your story to donors who care about your cause, at any scale, in real time. That's the power of Kindsight.
Yeah, it's interesting. So this is a question where, we updated from last year as well. And the vast majority is centered around capital projects, brick and mortar, like you said, around 60%. And that probably won't surprise people. Most of the time when you think about capital campaign, you think, oh, we need a new facility, new school building, new hospital wing. But there were other things that were being raised money for sure. There was an increase in comprehensive campaigns, which was interesting. About 25% of the respondents said it's all of the above. We've got a building project, new programs, endowment, all those capacity things that you mentioned. It was interesting. The top 2 were either everything at 25% or just a building at 60%. And as we were kind of parsing the cohorts, one thing that was interesting, and this was the case last year as well, was when we asked the question of just people who are thinking about a campaign, a lot of times they come to the table like, we want to do an endowment campaign, pure and simple. But then as you look at the cohorts to get further into a campaign and finished one, they either added things, added one thing or added multiple things. So campaigns tend to evolve through the planning process, which is sort of interesting. And I think this speaks to the need for strategic planning, feasibility study to, test the case for support, certainly. So there was a little bit of an evolution there, which was interesting, but most of the time it was sort of brick and mortar projects. Now, there are, of course, organizations that respond to the survey and that make up a big chunk of the sector that don't have physical property, right? They do research, they're pure programming, they're perhaps out on the street and don't have a physical project. Those types of organizations, we saw people talk about new initiatives, new programs, perhaps endowment. But by and large, it is those sort of physical building projects, which sort of makes sense, right? It's a little more tangible. I think it's maybe less of an uphill battle for those organizations because they can show something, right? They can take people on a tour of the construction site and say, hey, this is going to be great when it's finally finished. But that is not to discourage anyone from doing a campaign, because those people that did pure, endowment or new initiative campaigns, they were just as successful as well.
You said something so important, though, that these campaigns, whether they were for bricks and mortar or endowment or capacity and expanded programs, new initiatives, or any combination of those things, they were really driven by a strategic plan,
Yes.
a vision.
Yes. That was by far the biggest catalyst of campaigns, right? So I think it was right around 3/4, right around 74% of people. We asked, hey, what prompted the campaign, right? Was it a new leader coming on board, an organization anniversary, maybe a challenge gift? And those were usually single digit percentages, but by and large, about 3/4 of organizations said, hey, we went through a strategic planning process. We came out of that and said, let's do a campaign. We think we can do it. We're ready. We've got a big vision. So if you are listening to this and you are about to embark on strategic planning, you might want to look into some capital campaign resources, because it's very possible that that's going to be an outcome of that process.
Totally agree. And certainly the Capital Campaign Pro website has loads of resources to assist as you're formulating that vision and beginning to plan and explore how indeed you can make that strategic vision, that strategic plan come to life. And what will it take?
Definitely.
Yeah. So often we think about big organizations, colleges, universities, research centers, those big organizations as more likely to be successful in capital campaign fundraising. And that's true. They do have more resources, although I work with many of them and they are just as lean relative to their campaign goals as smaller organizations with potentially more modest goals. So would you talk to us a little bit about how small organizations fare with capital campaigns? Maybe those with $1 million annual budget or even less.
Yeah, we love small shops, and I know you do too, Tammy. So one thing I did with the data is I sort of parsed out people that were under $1 million. And that's a totally arbitrary kind of goalpost, but I had to cut it somewhere. So when I talk about small shops here and in the study, we're talking under $1 million. And that's not meant to be, pejorative or any way. And I know some people who are in the 10s or 20s consider themselves small, which is fine. But I looked at those people under $1 million. So this was a good chunk of the over 500 respondents that sent in their survey responses. For the most part, there weren't a lot of differences between them and the rest of the field. However, and this is something that we don't hear very often, but I'm delighted to say, there were a couple areas where small shops actually outperformed the rest of the field, where things were pretty similar were success rates. There were really no big differences, 1 or 2 percentage points in success rate differences. Goals were, of course, smaller, right? Rather than around 8 or 9 million for everyone, they were around 3 million, which is fine. That's still, a lot of money and can be transformative for an organization. But perhaps to a small organization, 3, 5, X the annual fund. So it's an aggressive goal for sure. But the success rates were just as good. But areas where they outperformed was really, really interesting. So for one thing, they tended to report higher levels of ED and board involvement in the campaign than everyone else. And this is interesting. So I sort of think that the reason for this is they're a small organization, right? A smaller team, maybe more grassroots in how they operate. Not surprising that they're not only relying on those members of leadership, but that those people are stepping up, right? Because I would assume that with a small organization, maybe there's a founder involved who has a real deep connection to the organization. So that's instructive to larger organizations to say, hey, those people need to participate in the campaign. Don't keep them on the sidelines. Just because you may have a bigger team or you're delegating things, perhaps to staff and volunteers, the ED and the board need to play a big role. So good job to small shops there. The other thing that they reported higher levels of than the rest of the field was that they said they built stronger donor relationships on average. So more people said that that was a benefit of the campaign than sort of the rest of the field, as well as fundraising system improvement. So we asked people, what were the benefits of your campaign besides just dollars raised? And small shops reported higher levels of those two things, major donor relationship building and fundraising system improvement. And I chalk those things up again to they're small. It's mostly their first campaign. An overwhelming number of these small shops said that it was their first campaign. So of course they're going to improve systems because they've never gone through the process before. And to be successful, and you know this better than anyone, Tammy, you've got to put some foundational things in place, right? So for small shops, capital campaigns can be a really interesting catalyst for a lot of these things, bringing the staff up to speed, putting a lot of those foundational systems in place, right? Maybe they get a database for the first time. Maybe they create a moves management process for the first time, right? A planned giving program. It could be any number of these things. And then just being small, of course, the people are going to meet with major donors and talk one-on-one. And that strengthens relationships far beyond the conclusion of the campaign, right? So be encouraged if you're listening to this and you consider yourself small, whether you're at $1 million, a little above, a little below, you're nervous about a campaign, you can do it. It really doesn't make a big difference. And in fact, smaller shops in some ways are even better positioned than their larger cohorts because perhaps the leadership is a little more involved. They're a little hungrier, maybe a little scrappier. But for everybody, the success roadmap is the same. Active ED and board, a clear case for support, talking to major donors, not being afraid to make big asks. Those things transcend the size of the organization for sure. So, be encouraged if you're one of those small guys, you can do it.
Yeah, I love that. It is encouraging. And you also, in that statement, in that response, really point to the critical nature of pre-campaign planning.
Yes.
Strengthening systems, looking at policies, getting clarity, and really developing that clear, compelling case for support. And the gift range chart, like all of the pieces that are, so integral to planning and developing a strategy for capital campaign success. Now, you did mention, and understandably so, that the research says that an engaged board, that an engaged executive director or CEO is a success factor, especially in these smaller nonprofits, but really not to the exclusion of the medium and large ones either.
Sure.
But does that mean that you need to have a big money, powerful board or a highly visible executive director?
Right. So this is sort of an interesting area to parse the definition of involvement, right? Because sometimes, organizations will come to us and say, we want to do a campaign. We think we can do it. We've got a clear project and a vision and case for support, got donors, but our board, and this is something I hear a lot, our board isn't wealthy. And by saying that, they think we can't do a campaign. So there seems to be this sense in the sector that a majority of the capital campaign dollars raised need to come from board members, therefore wealthy board members, right? So, we got a $10 million campaign. We got to raise 5 from the board. This is not the case. We flat out ask people, what percentage of your campaign dollars raised came from board members? It was only around 15%. Pretty low, right? And then when you compare that to the success rates being as high as they are, 96% satisfaction rate. And one thing we haven't said yet is the average goal raised was over 100%, 104, 106%. So people seem to be successful, even though board members are only contributing 15%. So you do not need dollars coming from board members, although of course it helps. But what you do need, and this is what I mean by differentiating it, you do need board involvement, board support. You need your boards to be on board with the campaign, right? Not to be too cute about it. they need to be champions of the campaign. They certainly need to know that you're doing it, why you're doing it, but also full-throated support of the campaign. So those are two different things, right? There is sort of support and involvement, and then there is giving. Both are good, but you don't need a majority of the dollars to come from the board. In fact, if you have a grassroots board that represents the community and really believes in the vision, as opposed to sort of, disconnected wealthy people, which sometimes, not to be too harsh, but sometimes boards do look like that, you may actually be better positioned for campaign success. So that's the dollars. So let's talk a little bit more about the challenges of board involvement. So we asked people sort of a blanket question: what were those headwinds that you encountered, right? Inflation, the pandemic, finding donors, all those things. So people could list a lot of things. When people listed that they struggled getting the board to be a part of the campaign, be excited, get involved, people who said that was a major challenge tended to perform poorly in other areas. Campaign, satisfaction rate, dollars raised, board giving, of course, because engagement, as you know, tends to lead to giving, right? Not the other way around. So even though you don't need the dollars coming from the board members, you do need that engagement and excitement from them, because it sort of filters down into other areas of the campaign. Now, I will say though, and this was a new question for this year, we asked people, just to kind of rate how involved EDs and board members are in fundraising in non-campaign years compared to during a campaign. Across the board, campaigns do tend to generate higher levels of ED fundraising and board member fundraising specifically. So again, this is another area where campaigns can be kind of a catalyst for good things to happen, improvements to happen. The trick there is to maintain that level of involvement after a campaign. My sense is that some of those numbers drop off, right? Because the campaign is what is generating and kind of encouraging those people to do. So it's very interesting, all the different ways that EDs and board members come into play in campaigns. But, parsing through all the data, the bottom line is the more involved they are, the better, notwithstanding financial contributions. That is not necessarily a recipe for success. And I always feel bad when those people come to me and say, oh, can we do it? We don't have a bunch of lawyers and doctors on our board. No offense to lawyers or doctors, but yes, you can do it. And you may actually be better positioned because of the makeup of that board.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen in the campaign clients that I've been an advisor to, my guidance to them is 100% board giving, a gift that is personally significant to them.
Yes.
A gift that they are proud of, especially in these days where we want more diverse and inclusive boards, which
Yes.
includes people of all ages and lived experiences. For some people, 200,000 is a gift that's relative to their means and their commitment.
Yep.
For other people, $200
Yes.
is a meaningful gift, and they all count. But the key, and you know this, I'm hoping most of our listeners know this, the key is 100% board giving above and beyond the annual fund gift.
Yeah.
Like, this is really special. I mean, these campaigns may happen every 7, 10 years or so, and it's a big deal.
And this is an area where the numbers aren't at 100%, unfortunately. It's right around 2/3 that gauge the campaign. And that sort of tracks with what I've seen, for regular annual fund gifts. It's right around 2/3. So there is some improvement there to be made for sure. But again, a capital campaign could be a catalyst for a lot of these things.
It can be a game changer. And I've seen it. And I know you have too, especially as you have done the surveys and talked with, so many of our campaign clients. And I don't want to step over the importance of that board involvement in the committee work, in making introductions. It doesn't mean every board member needs to be on a solicitation team, but certainly finding a place where their circle of influence, their gifts and talents can shine and really be maximized for the benefit of the campaign.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it looks different for each and every board member. The other thing that I want to kind of segue to is the role of consultants and campaign advisors. Like, what did the survey say about that and how it impacts capital campaign success?
Yeah. So we asked people varying degrees of questions around staffing, both internal and external, in terms of a consultant for help with the campaign. So there was a lot there, and I'll try to kind of zoom through the broad strokes. So most people did work with some kind of consultant, right? Around 2/3, which I think is good. And, take it with a grain of salt. I obviously represent an agency that helps with campaigns. You're a consultant as well who works with us. And I should say, and I meant to say this at the top, is there were very few of our clients represented percentage wise in the data. We really wanted this to be, a full sort of spectrum of the sector as a whole, rather than just like our clients. A lot of companies tend to put out research as like, well, this is just our clients. And of course, it's going to say the things they want to say, right? But that's not what we did here. So despite all of that, we did find that most people hire some sort of outside help, right? Around 2/3 of people. How those people participate in the campaign varied kind of more greatly than just that 2/3 number. And, I think this is a good thing. Capital campaigns, they're a big deal. They're hard. They last years in some cases. And it's not something that you sort of want to go in blind, right? Even if you're someone who has done campaigns in the past, just having someone that 2/3 doesn't really speak to level of involvement, right? This could be someone that did the whole campaign for you, right? They came to your location, stayed in a hotel room for 3 years and then flew out when the campaign was done, versus someone, maybe that resembles more how we work, Tammy, where it's someone that kind of flies alongside you, that's an accountability partner that kind of keeps you on track, but you're doing a little bit more of the work. So there's a huge spectrum in that help number, distilled in that 2/3 of people who hired some kind of outside help. But I think the point is, don't go it alone. Even if you can have someone that you just bounce a couple ideas off of a few times a month, they can help you create the campaign plan, help with the feasibility study. It's worth the investment, right? When we're talking about millions of dollars raised, if you can raise a few more million by spending a few, 5-6 figures on help, that's worth it, right? So definitely, invest in that would be my recommendation. Because again, comparing that to success rates, most of these people were happy and raised over 100%. And most of these people had help. So there does seem to be a little bit of a correlation there. Now, within that, some people had consultants conduct the feasibility study interviews, for example, although a great many had help, but still did the interviews themselves. And this is something we're keeping an eye on because, 10 years ago, if we had done this study, my sense is that would have been a very small percentage of people that worked with a consultant, but still did the interviews themselves and a feasibility study. That seems to be changing. So this is one thing I'm going to keep an eye on year to year. Of course, I'll keep an eye on every data point, but this is what I'll really be looking at because my sense is that's going to continue to grow as people discover that, maybe it would be better if we talk to our own donors, even while still having external consultants help and support us in doing that. But, the bottom line is most people do work with some sort of outside help for a campaign.
That's helpful. Stephen, there's often a fear that capital campaign fundraising will cannibalize the annual fund. The bread and butter contributions that keep our core services going, that keep the lights on. I know you tested this in the study. What did you find?
Yeah, this was probably a top 3 thing that we wanted to find out when we first conceived this study a couple of years ago. So again, when we talk to people, it's a top 3 thing that we hear. Like, we want to do a campaign, but gosh, we're worried about the annual fund. Isn't it true that while we raise a bunch of money for the campaign, the annual fund suffers? So we're sort of, robbing Peter to pay Paul, for a lack of a better word there. Now, prior to the study, when we would encounter that question, we would say it rarely happens in our work. And, and us, and I would assume most campaign consultants take steps to prevent that. And there are very specific things you can do. And we could probably do a whole day podcast about those things. So again, we wanted to put some hard data behind this, and also hard data that doesn't just come from our clients, because it was our sense internally that, yeah, it can happen, but there are definitely things you can do to prevent it. It's by no means a foregone conclusion that your annual fund is going to suffer. So now I'm happy to say that after 2 years of doing this study, most people are reporting that the annual fund does not suffer. So we asked this question of both people in a campaign and people who have recently completed a campaign. First, what happened to the annual fund during the campaign? Almost 80% of people said that it either increased or stayed the same. So only about 20% of people are seeing decreases there. And again, there are things you can do to mitigate that. And it may be that those people simply aren't doing those things, right? And then we asked just the post-campaign cohort, hey, what has happened to the annual fund in the ensuing years after the campaign? Again, over 80% said that it either increased or stayed the same. So this does not seem to be something that has to happen. And in most cases, it does not happen. But I would guess that these organizations, probably because they're working with a consultant or getting some sort of expert guidance, are putting pieces in place there to prevent things like you said, hey, it's over and above the annual fund goal, right? It's how you sort of communicate the ask and the solicitation and the purpose and the destination of the money. That is all very helpful. But by no means does it have to happen. And in some cases, the campaign for the people in the post-campaign cohort, 74% said that it increased after the campaign. Now, maybe that came from 20% who saw a little bit of a reduction during the campaign. So it's sort of breaks even, but that's still a big chunk of people who saw a net increase in the annual fund. So again, the campaigns are such a fun catalyst for so many interesting things beyond just raising the money for that one specific project in the campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other reasons for those increases is often for a capital campaign, we're looking a little further back to people who had been loyal givers, who had been,
Yes.
very generous within their means, and we're reconnecting with them.
Yes.
And they kind of felt left out, like, oh, they don't need me anymore. And the catalyst of the campaign and the continued engagement when the campaign is concluded is one of the reasons that it can increase. And I think likewise, it's important to really be aware and intentional that once someone has given a capital gift, we think, oh, shoo, the campaign is done. We were successful, confetti. But
Right.
for the donor, it's just beginning again, right? And we need to pick up that ball and continue stewarding and engaging and showcasing and appreciating those supporters. So
Absolutely.
their increased annual fund giving is a logical response to that engagement.
Yeah. But it's unfortunately a kind of a misnomer. It's a little bit of a myth, right? It seems logical, but you kind of have to see this data to break through, because there's this assumption that, oh, they're going to give to the campaign instead of the annual fund, right?
Yes.
That's sort of the prevailing logic, but it doesn't seem to be the case at all for all the reasons you said.
Yeah. And now for a final word from our sponsor.
Every fundraiser knows that the secret to success lies in creating authentic connections. This starts with data, but that data needs to turn into insights that inspire action, which in turn fosters generosity and long-term donor relationships. Kindsight's fundraising intelligence solution lets any nonprofit do just that at any scale, with the world's largest proprietary donor database, AI-powered content generation, an award-winning CRM built specifically for fundraising teams, and much more. Go to kindsight.io to see it in action.
Well, I think that this study is, as you've said, it is so encouraging So if you're on the fence about a capital campaign or you're contemplating one down the road, I just encourage everyone to download the findings from this study. Again, Stephen and I are talking before it's actually released, but by the time you hear this conversation, it will be a link to
Yes.
download from the show notes in this episode and certainly from the Capital Campaign Pro website. Over the course of our conversation, Stephen, we have not had enough time to discuss every single insight from this benchmark report. If there was one additional insight that we haven't talked about that you think our listeners should know, what would it be?
Yeah, there's a lot in the study. It's many pages long. And yeah, we haven't covered hardly anything. But it's funny you ask, when I was circulating the draft of this year's report internally, Amy, our co-founder, she responded in big, bold letters, the stat I'm about to read to you. It's not quite buried in the report. It's kind of in the middle, but it's a big deal. So we asked people what percentage of their campaign goal was raised with just the top 20 gifts. And the answer was around 70%. So very close to that Pareto principle number, right? That 80% of the dollars raised comes from 20% of the people. It was almost exactly that, definitely in the neighborhood, right? So that's a big one. And that again was across the board. So as you are embarking on a campaign, and that's not to say that people can't be successful raising money through a lot of, smaller to mid-sized gifts. You definitely can do that. But most campaigns, they're lead gifts, right? So, we typically refer to these as lead gifts. There are people that are giving 6, 7 figures that during the quiet phase, right? So that when we go public, we can say, hey, we're already at 70, 80% of the goal. And then the rest of those sort of smaller gifts come in to finish up. But it just seems like we can't get away from that Pareto principle, right? And this is 100 years or more of fundraising. That's sort of been a foundational thing. Still tends to be the case there. So just, be aware that that may be a roadmap to your success, right? It doesn't have to be the only roadmap or the one that you follow, but tends to be the one that most people do follow. So as you're thinking about your feasibility study, for example, who are those people in our orbit? And it's not going to be strangers, right? Can happen, but it's not going to be just, who's wealthy in our neighborhood, right? Whether or not they even know about us, but who in the list, that we should talk to in the study that could give a big lead gift, 6, 7 figures. That's important to consider when planning your feasibility study, for example.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Such good stuff. Thank you. Thank you. Typically, as you know, as a repeat guest, we usually wrap up the episode with some rapid fire questions. Are you game again this
Let's
year?
do it.
All right. First question. What's the best fundraising advice you've ever heard?
I thought of this when we were talking about the small shops data in this study. Andrea, our other co-founder, as she was looking at the study, and this was from last year, but it still holds true this year, is, when we talk about how the small shops, there really weren't a lot of differences in the rest of the organizations. The biggest difference was the amount of zeros. And I actually think that's pretty good fundraising advice. Like, no matter what size you are, you can do everything that we're talking about. Those results are just going to be perhaps a little less zeros at the end of that number, but you can still do it. And that's still a good number for you to raise. So keep that in mind. If you're a smaller shop or think you're too small to do something, you're probably not. It just comes down to the amount of zeros. That's really the only difference.
And it's all relative.
Yes.
What book do you recommend to our audience and why?
Well, it seems like AI is a big topic, right? Perhaps even more than when we talked this time last year, which seems unbelievable how far things have advanced since then. There's a futurist named Ray Kurzweil, and he has written about, all this stuff for decades. He's got a book called The Singularity is Nearer. I think it's really instructive on what sort of the conclusion of this sort of AI renaissance is going to be for us. Check that out. Not a fundraising book. Not even necessarily an AI book, but I think it's instructive for this sort of new world we find ourselves in with ChatGPT and all these tools that are sort of starting to dominate all of our work.
I will check it out. What are the 3 most important traits you think a successful fundraiser must possess?
Well, I've got sort of my capital campaign blinders on, so I'll answer in that context. I think listening, obviously that's a big thing when you're doing a feasibility study, eagerness to be coached, when we're thinking about hiring outside help. And then, we talked about this a lot today already, but just being fearless, right? Not letting things stop you or, oh, it's too tough out there for people. We shouldn't ask for money right now. Or, gee, it seems like a bad time. To your analogy, it's never a good time to have kids. So just do it, right? You're never fully ready, but don't let anything stop you if you've got a big vision and a big project that you want to achieve. So, be fearless.
Very good. What's your favorite fundraising application or tool?
Oh, wow. I think, last year we talked about some AI tools like maybe Givesy or Momentum. One I'm keeping an eye on is called FundMiner, FundMiner, FundMiner. If you are in higher ed or maybe a big healthcare system, for example, and you have a lot of different funds that you need to track at the outgoing of the money you come in, check that out. It's kind of the first of its kind fund management software. Really interesting. I'm seeing a lot of higher ed folks using that and finding a lot of dollars and then able to kind of communicate that back to donors. So the end goal is communicating back to supporters, which for all the things you said earlier is of paramount importance. So check that out if maybe you're one of those types.
What's your favorite conference and why?
Oh, well, right now I'm plowing through the recordings of the Fundraising AI Summit that I think our mutual friends, Nathan and Mallory Erickson, have been doing over the past few weeks. So again, if you're interested in AI, that's probably the one to watch and go to next year if you missed it, because they're covering it from all angles, which is really useful right now.
Yeah, it was amazing. And they're so generous to make those recordings available on their website, fundraising.ai. Knowing what you know now about fundraising, what advice would you give your younger self?
My younger self tended to be kind of a wait and see type person when it came to technology. And now I've ventured out into maybe more of an early adopter. It seems like being an early adopter pays dividends. So, I know there's a lot of stuff out there and it can feel overwhelming, but if you can carve out some time in your day to at least investigate and test and try some things, you may find some interesting tools that can really help the organization that you may have ignored or missed just because you didn't set aside the time to check them out. So I know there's a lot out there, but if you can carve some time out and adopt some things, you may have an edge over some other people.
Amazing advice. Stephen, it's been awesome to talk with you. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your insights and for leading this study.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. If you want to learn more about Stephen Shattuck, Capital Campaign Pro, or if you want to download your very own copy of the 2024 State of Capital Campaigns Benchmark Report, check out the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast, and keep on transforming your fundraising so you can transform the world. The Intentional Fundraiser Podcast is a Fundraising Transformed original. It's hosted by me, Tammy Zonker, founder and president of Fundraising Transformed, where we help equip and empower fundraisers, nonprofit leaders, and board members to transform their fundraising so they can transform the world. Visit fundraisingtransform.com/podcast to subscribe to this podcast and subscribe to my newsletter to get fundraising lessons, tools, and helpful resources delivered straight to your inbox each month. If you want my help with taking your fundraising to the next level, become a member of my Fundraising Transformers community as a growth member and join me live each month where I'll teach you the same strategies I use to lead, train, and coach thousands of nonprofits, social service organizations, healthcare foundations, private schools, colleges, and universities to collectively raise more than $500 million, including a single gift of $27.1 million. As a member, you can participate in my Ask Me Anything sessions every month and get answers to your burning questions. Chat with other growth members inside our private and safe online community about what you're working on, struggling with, and share lessons learned. And get instant access to my growing library of on-demand self-paced training classes. New content is added every single month. Learn more about becoming a member at fundraisingtransform.com/growth. Talk soon.